The silence was never silent. Tertius Calvera stood in the observation chamber of the Serpent's Promise, his third eye bleeding light through the thick leather binding that covered his forehead. The pain was constant now. A hot wire threaded through the meat of his brain, but pain was familiar. Pain was manageable. It was the whispers that truly tested him. They had been calling his name for the past 6 hours. Navigator Calvera. The Rogue Trader requests your presence on the command deck. The servitor's voice crackled through the vox caster, monotone and dead. Calvera envied that emptiness. To be lobotomized, to have the thinking parts carved away and replaced with blessed machinery, would be a mercy beyond measure. He turned from the viewport, where the Mandeville point hung like a wound in reality, and straightened his crimson robes. The fabric was embroidered with protective runes that his house had spent 3 centuries perfecting. They helped. Not much, but enough that he could still form coherent thoughts after a transit. Some navigators from lesser houses went mad before their 3rd decade. Calvera was approaching his 5th, and his mind remained largely intact. Largely. The command deck of the Serpent's Promise sprawled before him like a cathedral to human ambition. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into incense-thick shadows, while thousands of servitors and crew members worked at their stations in a choreographed symphony of imperial efficiency. Rogue Trader Matthias Korvax stood at the center of it all, a towering figure in ornate powered armor, his face half hidden behind a gilded rebreather. The man radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having stared into the warp's infinite maw. Tertius. Korvax's voice boomed across the deck. We make for the veiled reaches. I've negotiated an exclusive trade contract with the Forge world of Metallica. The profit margins are extraordinary. Calvera's third eye throbbed beneath its binding. The veiled reaches. 6 weeks of warp transit through a region of the Immaterium known for its instability. He had made the journey twice before. The first time, he had lost 2 teeth from grinding them so hard against the psychic pressure. The second time, something that wore his mother's face had followed him back into real space and whispered secrets about his birth until he had thrown himself into a stasis field for 3 days. The Astronomican's light is weak in that sector, Calvera said, keeping his voice level. And the warp storms have been intensifying. Intelligence from the Navis Nobilite suggests that 4 Navigator houses have lost vessels in that region within the past solar year. Korvax waved a dismissive hand. 4 vessels out of thousands. Acceptable losses. Besides, you're the best navigator I've ever worked with. Tertius, you've never failed me. That was the problem with those who did not bear the Navigator gene. They thought of the warp as merely dangerous, like a violent ocean or a hostile Xenos planet. They did not understand that the Immaterium was not simply a place. It was a realm of pure thought and emotion, where the laws of physics dissolved into the fever dreams of a howling eternity. Every transit was not a journey through space, but a plunge into the collective nightmares of every sentient being that had ever lived or would ever live. When do you wish to depart? Calvera asked. Immediately. We're losing profit for every hour we delay. Profit. The word tasted like ash in Calvera's mouth, but he nodded. This was the bargain he had made, the same bargain every navigator made. His house, Calvera, was minor among the Navis Nobilite, not wealthy enough to pick and choose their contracts. Korvax paid well, and paid on time, and had never asked Calvera to do anything overtly heretical. That put him in the top quartile of employers. I will prepare for translation, Calvera said, and turned away before Korvax could see the tremor that ran through his hands. The navigation chamber sat at the apex of the voidship, a spherical room 20 meters in diameter. Isolated from the rest of the vessel by 3 sets of psychically shielded bulkheads, Calvera entered through the final door, and the silence hit him like a physical force. Not the false silence of the observation deck, but true quiet, achieved through acoustic dampening and psychic nullification. In this chamber, Even the whispers from the warp were muted to a distant murmur. He settled into the Navigator's throne, a massive construction of brass and adamantium that held his body in a semi-recumbent position. Servitor tended cables clicked into the ports along his spine, feeding him the voidships' sensory data. He could feel the serpent's promise now, all 15 kilometers of her, the thrum of her plasma drives, the nervous tension of her 30,000 souls. Calvera reached up and began to unwrap the leather binding that covered his third eye. The sensation was always the same, like peeling away a scab from a wound that would never heal. The leather fell away, and his warp eye opened. The universe exploded into impossible color. Where his two biological eyes saw the navigation chamber, his third eye saw everything else. It saw the thin membrane of reality that separated the Immaterium from the Immaterium, saw the roiling chaos that pressed against that membrane like an ocean against a dam. The Astronomicon blazed in the distance, the Emperor's psychic lighthouse, the only fixed point in the madness. It was a pillar of golden light that tore through the warp like a spear, and every navigator oriented themselves by that sacred flame. Except the Astronomicon was not a comfortable light. Staring at it was like staring at the sun, if the sun was also staring back at you, if it knew your every sin and weakness and judged you with the weight of 10,000 years of holy purpose. Calvera forced himself to focus. He had done this hundreds of times. The key was not to let his attention wander, not to look too deeply into the spaces between the light. That was where they waited. Navigator Calvera to command deck. Beginning translation sequence. Acknowledged. Came Korvax's response through the Vox. Emperor, guide your sight. Calvera almost laughed. The Emperor was not in the business of guidance anymore. He was a rotting corpse on a golden throne, and whatever consciousness remained was too busy keeping the Astronomicon lit to concern itself with one navigator's fear. But there were other things in the warp that were very concerned indeed. The Gellar field activated with a deep, resonant hum that Calvera felt in his bones. The field was the only thing that kept the warp from tearing the ship apart, a bubble of real space projected around the vessel by ancient, barely understood technology. With the field active, they could exist within the Immaterium without immediately being torn to pieces by daemons. Immediately was the key word. The Gellar field was not perfect. It could fail. It could flicker. And in that moment of failure, everything inside the bubble would be exposed to things that should not exist. Calvera had seen the aftermath of a Gellar field failure once during his apprenticeship. The ship had been recovered, drifting in real space, intact but silent. When the recovery teams had breached the hull, they found the crew, all 37,000 of them. The details were classified, but Calvera had access to the Navis Nobulate's restricted archives. The crew had not been killed. They had been improved. The daemons had taken their time, reshaping flesh and bone into new configurations, creating art from agony. Some of the crew were still alive when the recovery teams arrived, if alive was the right word for things that should not have continued functioning with their organs rearranged so creatively. Translation in 30 seconds. Calvera announced, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. He reached out with his third eye, found the weak point in reality, and pulled. The universe screamed. The serpent's promise dropped out of real space like a stone falling into an ocean, and the ocean was screaming back. Calvera's third eye burned with the sight of it, the raw chaos of the Immaterium crashing against his consciousness. This was the warp, the place where thought and reality were one, where emotion became substance, where the collective psychic energy of every soul in the galaxy churned in an eternal storm. And in that storm, things noticed him. The first whisper came almost immediately. Tertius. It was his mother's voice, the same tone she had used when he was a child, when she had held him after the black ships came to collect him for navigator training. He knew it was not her. His mother had been dead for 40 years, her soul long since consumed by the Emperor's endless hunger for psychic sustenance. But knowing something was false did not stop it from hurting. Tertius, why did you leave me? Calvera focused on the Astronomicon, using it as an anchor. The golden light cut through the warp's chaos, giving him a reference point. He began to chart a course, his third eye picking out the currents and eddies in the Immaterium, finding the path that would take them toward the veiled reaches. You could have saved me, his mother's voice continued. You had power, even then, but you let them take you away. You abandoned me. The words wormed into his skull, carrying a psychic weight that made his temples throb. This was the warp's favorite game, taking memories and twisting them into weapons. Daemons did not have to invent tortures. They simply amplified the pain that already existed. 15 degrees to port, Calvera announced, his voice mechanical. Maintain current velocity. The Serpent's Promise responded, her plasma drives adjusting course. Around the ship, the warp wreathed, an infinite expanse of impossible geometry and screaming color. Calvera could see things moving in the depths, vast shapes that defied description. Some were daemons, predators of the Immaterium, seeking any crack in the Geller field. Others were harder to classify, echoes of emotions so powerful they had achieved a kind of half-life in the warp. I'm still here, his mother whispered. I never left. Every time you enter the warp, I'm waiting. Calvera's hands clenched on the throne's armrests, hard enough that the metal groaned. This was hour one of a transit that would last weeks. He had 6 weeks of this ahead of him, 6 weeks of psychological warfare waged by entities that could peel back his mind like an overripe fruit. A navigator's training was extensive, years of mental conditioning designed to help them resist the warp's influence. They were taught meditation techniques, psychic wards, prayers to the Emperor. But no amount of training could truly prepare someone for the reality of it. The warp was not a test that could be passed. It was an endurance trial that lasted until either the journey ended or the navigator's mind shattered. And minds did shatter. The Navis Nobilite did not advertise their attrition rate, but Calvera had done the mathematics. Roughly 1 in 5 navigators died or went permanently insane before reaching retirement age, and retirement itself was not the peaceful reward it sounded like. A navigator who spent decades staring into the warp accumulated damage, small fractures in their psyche that widened with each transit. Most retired navigators spent their final years in secured facilities, their minds too compromised to be trusted in normal society. Calvera himself had already noticed the warning signs, the nightmares that persisted even when he was awake, the way certain sounds made him flinch, sounds that no one else could hear, the taste of copper in his mouth whenever he was stressed, despite the medical servitors assuring him that he was not bleeding. He announced, 10 degrees to starboard, warp, current shifting. The journey continued. Hours blended into days, and days into weeks. Calvera existed in a state of controlled terror, his third eye constantly open, constantly watching, constantly being watched in return. The whispers never stopped. Sometimes they were his mother. Sometimes they were his father, dead before Calvera had been born. Sometimes they were children who called him uncle and begged him to play with them. Their voices sweet and innocent right up until they started describing what they wanted to do to his flesh. On the 8th day of transit, something new happened. Calvera was charting a course around a particularly violent warp storm, a roiling mass of psychic energy that registered as anger and hatred so concentrated it had achieved physical form. The Serpent's Promise was navigating the edge of the storm, using its momentum to slingshot toward their destination. When Calvera's third eye caught movement, something was keeping pace with the ship. It was enormous, far larger than the voidship, a shape that his mind refused to properly process. One moment it looked like a vast serpent, scales made of screaming faces. The next it was a geometric impossibility, angles that should not exist arranged in patterns that made his biological eyes water. The thing radiated malevolence, Not the casual cruelty of a lesser daemon, but the focused hatred of something ancient and purposeful. Al crew to battle stations. Calvera transmitted, fighting to keep his voice steady. Possible hostile entity detected. Confirmed. Korvax responded immediately. What are we dealing with? How could Calvera explain? The thing outside was not something that could be fought with weapons. It was not even something that could be properly perceived. It existed in the warp, which meant it existed in thought and emotion as much as in any physical form. Unknown classification, Calvera said. Recommend increasing speed. Already at maximum safe velocity, Navigator. Then exceed safe velocity. Now, there must have been something in Calvera's tone, because Korvax did not argue. The plasma drive surged, pushing the Serpent's promise faster through the Immaterium. But the entity kept pace, effortlessly matching their speed. It was studying them. Calvera could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing against the Geller field, testing it for weaknesses. The entity was old, so old that it remembered the war in heaven, when the galaxy was young and the warp was still relatively calm. It had watched civilizations rise and fall, had fed on the suffering of trillions, and now it was curious about this ship, about the souls contained within. Tertius. The voice was not his mother's this time. It was his own voice, speaking from outside his head. Let me in. I only want to talk. The entity was trying to establish a psychic connection, to create a bridge between itself and Calvera's mind. If it succeeded, if Calvera allowed even the smallest opening, the thing could pour itself into his consciousness and use him as a gateway to the ship. Calvera slammed down his mental defenses, layers of psychic conditioning activating in a cascade of protective wards. The Emperor's name became a mantra, repeated over and over in his thoughts. He focused on the Astronomicon, letting its light burn away the probing tendrils of the entity's consciousness. Navigator, your vitals are spiking, came the voice of the ship's medica officer. Do you require assistance? Negative. Calvera managed. Continue course. Do not deviate. The entity followed them for 3 days. 3 days of constant pressure against Calvera's mind, of whispers and promises and threats delivered in his own voice. It offered him power, knowledge, release from pain. It showed him visions of what the galaxy would become, cycles of birth and death and rebirth stretching into infinity. It promised that if he simply opened his third eye a little wider, looked a little deeper, he would understand truths that would make all his suffering worthwhile. Calvera refused, not because he was strong, but because he was a coward, and he knew that whatever understanding the entity offered would come at a price he could not afford to pay. On the 4th day, the entity lost interest and fell away, disappearing back into the deeper currents of the warp. Calvera sagged in his throne, his robes drenched with sweat, his hands trembling. The medical servitors immediately began administering stimulants and nutrient paste, trying to restore his depleted reserves. Navigator to command, he croaked. Threat has passed. Estimate arrival at Mandeville Point in 19 days. Understood, Korvax replied. Excellent work, Tertius. I'll see that your bonus reflects your performance. Bonus. The word almost made Calvera laugh. What bonus could compensate for 3 days of psychological siege by a daemon that had existed since before humanity learned to make fire? What amount of throne guilt was worth the lingering feeling of violation? The knowledge that something had been inside his mind, rummaging through his memories like a merchant through a junk pile. But he said nothing. This was the bargain. This was always the bargain. The journey continued. Calvera's third eye remained open, constantly scanning, constantly vigilant. He slept in 20-minute intervals, never allowing himself to drop into deep rest. Full sleep was too dangerous. In sleep, the mind's defenses weakened, and the things in the warp could slip through the cracks. He had known navigators who had fallen asleep during transit. Their bodies continued to function. Their third eyes continued to guide the ship, but something fundamental had changed. They would complete the journey, translate back into real space, and then begin acting strangely. Sometimes the changes were subtle, little tics and mannerisms that had not existed before. Sometimes the changes were dramatic, like the Navigator who had arrived at her destination and immediately begun prophesying in a language that should not exist, her voice layered with harmonics that made servitors malfunction. The Navis Nobilite had protocols for such cases. The Navigator would be quietly retired, taken to a secure facility where they could be studied and, if necessary, terminated. The information gathered from these failures helped refine training protocols for future generations. It was a cold calculus, but the Empyrean ran on cold calculus. Every soul had a purpose, and when that purpose could no longer be fulfilled, the soul was discarded. Efficiency was holy. Waste was heresy. On the 23rd day of transit, Calvera noticed something wrong with the Astronomicon. The golden light that served as humanity's guiding star was flickering. Not much, barely perceptible, but to a navigator's third eye, even a slight dimming was cause for alarm. The Astronomicon was powered by the Emperor himself. Channeling his psychic might through the sacrifice of 10,000 psychers daily. For it to flicker meant something was interfering with that process. Calvera immediately began calculating alternative courses. If the Astronomicon failed completely, even for a moment, every ship in the warp would be lost. Millions of vessels, carrying billions of souls, all stranded in the Immaterium with no way to navigate home. It would be the single greatest catastrophe in imperial history, dwarfing even the Horus heresy. But the flicker stabilized. The golden light burned steady once more, and Calvera allowed himself a shuddering breath of relief. Still, the incident troubled him. The Astronomicon was supposed to be eternal, unwavering. For it to show any weakness suggested that even the Emperor's power had limits. The thought was dangerously close to heresy, and Calvera pushed it away. The Emperor was immortal. The Emperor was all-powerful. The Emperor protected. These were truths that could not be questioned, because if they were false, then everything else was false, and there was no point to any of the suffering. Approaching the veiled reaches, Calvera announced on the 35th day of transit, entering high-risk zone. The warp grew worse as they penetrated deeper into the region. The currents became violent, unpredictable, and the things lurking in the depths grew bolder. Calvera saw daemons now, not just the shadows and suggestions of earlier in the journey, but fully manifested entities. Bloodletters prowled alongside the ship, their brass blades gleaming with impossible light. Horrors drifted past, their eyes watching, always watching. The Jeller field held, but Calvera could see the strain. The field flickered once, just for a microsecond, and in that brief instant, he felt something from the lower decks. A scream, cut off almost before it began. Then the field stabilized, and the moment passed. Report from Deck 17. Came the Vox transmission. One crew member suffered a seizure. Medical team responding. Calvera said nothing. He knew what had happened. In that microsecond of field failure, something from the warp had reached through and touched that crew member's soul. They would recover, physically, but they would be changed. They would see things that were not there. They would hear whispers in the silence. And eventually, they would have to be confined or executed, because the taint would spread. This was the true cost of warp travel. Not just the fuel and the maintenance and the navigator's fee, but the slow erosion of sanity that affected everyone aboard. Crew members who made multiple warp transits accumulated psychic damage, invisible scars that never truly healed. The Imperium compensated by rotating crew frequently, but on a rogue trader's vessel, where the same people might serve for decades. The damage compounded. Calvera wondered sometimes how many of the Serpent's Promise's crew were still entirely human. How many had been touched by the warp, marked in ways too subtle to detect, slowly transforming into something other. The thought kept him awake during his 20-minute rest periods. On the 42nd day, they reached the Mandeville point for the veiled reaches. Calvera's third eye picked out the weak spot in reality, the place where the membrane between the warp and real space was thin enough to pierce. He guided the serpent's promise toward it, feeling the familiar dread that accompanied every translation back to real space. This was the most dangerous moment of any journey. During translation, the Geller field had to drop for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, the ship was completely vulnerable. Daemons waited at mandeville points like predators at a watering hole, hoping to catch a vessel during that moment of weakness. "All hands, brace for translation," Calvera announced. He reached out with his third eye, found the exact angle and moment, and pushed. The universe inverted. The serpent's promise lurched, reality reasserting itself with brutal force. And then they were through. Real space. Beautiful, mundane, comprehensible real space. Calvera slumped in his throne, feeling the weight of 6 weeks crash down on him. His third eye closed, the leather bindings wrapping themselves back into place with automatic precision. The whispers faded, not gone but muted to the background noise they always were. "Translation successful," he reported. "We have arrived at the veiled reaches. All systems nominal. Outstanding work, Tertius," Korvax responded, his voice booming with satisfaction. "I knew I could count on you. We'll conduct our business with Metallica and be ready to return within the month. You've earned a rest. A month. 4 weeks in real space. Precious time to let his mind recover before the return journey." Calvera should have felt relief, but instead, he felt only hollow exhaustion. He had survived another transit, but survival was becoming harder each time. The medical servitors disconnected him from the throne, and he stumbled toward his quarters on unsteady legs. His body ached from weeks of immobility, his muscles atrophied despite the stimulants. He would spend the next few days in physical rehabilitation, rebuilding strength, trying to remember what it felt like to be human. Calvera's quarters were modest, a 10 by 10 meter space containing a bunk, a desk, and a small shrine to the Emperor. He collapsed onto the bunk without bothering to remove his robes, his body screaming for sleep. But sleep did not come easy. It never did after a transit. He lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, and listened to the whispers that never truly stopped. They were quieter now, barely audible, but they were there. They had always been there, ever since his first journey, slowly accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a river. Tertius. His mother's voice, soft and sad. "One day you'll listen. One day you'll understand." Calvera closed his eyes and prayed for dawn. The weeks in real space passed in a blur of physical therapy and psychological evaluation. The ship's Medicae officer, a grizzled veteran named Harkin, ran him through a battery of tests designed to detect warp corruption. Most were crude. Little more than asking him to recite catechisms and checking his pupils for unusual dilation. The more sophisticated tests required a sanctioned psyker to probe his mind, searching for the telltale resonances of daemonic taint. Calvera passed all the tests, as he always did. The corruption inside him was too subtle, too well integrated to be detected by standard methods. He had learned to hide it, even from himself most of the time. But late at night, when the ship was quiet and the rest of the crew slept, Calvera would sometimes stand before the mirror in his quarters and unwrap the leather binding on his third eye. He would force himself to look at his reflection, to see what he was becoming. The third eye stared back at him, a lidless orb that saw too much. The iris was no longer quite human, flecked with colors that did not exist in the Immaterium. And around the eye, spreading across his forehead in a pattern like frost on glass, were the beginnings of mutation. Thin lines of silver traced under his skin, psychic scarring from decades of exposure to the warp. Soon, the scarring would spread. His house had records going back thousands of years, and the pattern was always the same. Navigators accumulated damage, their bodies slowly warping to accommodate the psychic stress. Some developed additional eyes. Others grew vestigial limbs or found their bones reshaping into new configurations. The mutations were rarely overtly demonic. more like the body attempting to adapt to an environment it was never meant to endure. Calvera traced one of the silver lines with his finger, feeling the unnatural coldness of it. How long did he have before the mutations became too pronounced to hide? 5 years. 10. And when that day came, what then? The Navis Nobilite would retire him, certainly, but retirement for a navigator was not the peaceful old age enjoyed by other imperial citizens. It was confinement, study, and eventual disposal, when the corruption could no longer be contained. He wrapped the leather binding back into place and returned to his bunk. There was no point dwelling on the inevitable. He was a navigator. This was his purpose, assigned to him by birth and genetics. He would serve until he could no longer serve, and then he would be discarded, and another navigator would take his place. The cycle would continue, as it had continued for 10,000 years. On the 27th day in real space, Korvax summoned him to the command deck. The rogue trader looked pleased, his augmetic eye glowing with satisfaction. Tertius, excellent news. The negotiations with Metallica were even more profitable than anticipated. We've secured exclusive contracts for 3 new product lines. The return journey will make us all wealthy men. Calvera nodded, knowing what was coming. I trust you're rested and ready for the return transit. Korvax continued. Of course, Lord Trader. Excellent. We depart at first bell tomorrow. I want to return to the Ultima Segmentum before our competitors realize what we've acquired. Calvera felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders. Tomorrow, they would enter the warp again, and he would open his third eye and stare into the abyss, and the abyss would stare back. 6 more weeks of whispers and horror. 6 more weeks of fighting to keep his sanity intact. But he was a navigator, and this was his duty. I will prepare the navigation chamber, Calvera said. The return journey began at dawn. Calvera settled into the throne, allowed the servitors to connect the neural cables, and unwrapped his third eye. The universe exploded into impossible color once more, and he began the familiar process of finding the weak point in reality. The serpent's promise dropped into the warp, and the whispers began immediately. Welcome back, Tertius. His mother's voice, warm and loving.
Did you miss me?
Calvera focused on the Astronomicon and began to chart their course. The return journey would follow a different path than the outbound transit, as warp currents were never the same twice. He found a relatively stable route and guided the ship into it, feeling the Immaterium's chaos press against his consciousness. This journey was different from the start. The warp felt more aggressive, more alive. The daemons that shadowed the ship were more numerous, more bold. Something had changed in the 6 weeks they had spent in real space, some shift in the Immaterium's endless turmoil. On the 3rd day of the return transit, the first crew member went mad. It was a junior officer, a woman named Sarika who had served aboard the Serpent's Promise for 15 years. She was found in the crew quarters, screaming about angels with too many wings and eyes that wept blood. The medical team sedated her and confined her to the infirmary, but her screams continued even through the sedation. Navigator, we have a situation. Korvax transmitted. The Jeller field is holding. Correct. Confirmed. Calvera replied, though he could see the strain on the field more clearly than anyone. But the warp is unusually active. Recommend increased vigilance. 2 more crew members succumbed to madness on the 5th day, then 4 more on the 7th. The pattern was clear to Calvera. The warp was leaking through, finding cracks in the ship's psychic defenses, touching the minds of those most vulnerable. The afflicted crew members were confined, restrained, their minds too far gone to recover. On the 11th day, something vast moved beneath the ship. Calvera's third eye caught it first, a presence in the deeper currents of the warp, something so large that it defied comprehension. It was not a daemon, not exactly, but something else, something older. A psychic echo of a civilization that had died millennia ago, compressed and twisted by the warp into a semi-conscious entity. The entity did not attack. It simply existed, and its existence was enough to send waves of psychic pressure through the Immaterium. The serpent's promise was caught in those waves, tossed like a leaf in a hurricane. Calvera fought to maintain course, using the Astronomicon as his anchor, but the strain was immense. "All decks, secure for turbulence," he transmitted, his voice tight with effort. The ship bucked and rolled, her hull groaning under stresses it was never designed to withstand. Crew members were thrown against bulkheads. Equipment tore free from its mountings, and the gellar field flickered. In that flicker, daemons poured in. They manifested in the lower decks first, where the gellar field was weakest. Bloodletters and plague-bearers and shrieking horrors, spilling into real space through tears in reality. The crew fought back with lasguns and prayer. But they were mortals fighting entities of pure warp stuff, and the outcome was never in doubt. "All hands to battle stations," Korvax roared over the Vox. "Repel boarders. The Emperor protects." But the Emperor was not protecting today. The Emperor was 10,000 light years away, locked in an eternal struggle on the Golden Throne, and the Serpent's promise was alone in the warp, with things that should not exist. Calvera could not look away from his navigation, could not spare attention for the battle raging through the ship. He had to maintain course, had to keep them moving toward the Mandeville point, or they would be lost forever. The daemons would slaughter every soul aboard, and the ship would drift in the warp until it was consumed. He focused on the Astronomicon, using its light to burn away his fear. The golden radiance cut through the chaos, giving him strength. He was a navigator of House Calvera, trained from birth for this exact moment. He would not fail. The gellar field stabilized. The tiers in reality began to close, and one by one, the daemons were forced back into the warp, screaming their frustration. But the damage was done. 37 crew members dead, torn apart by demonic claws. Another 50 wounded, their bodies and minds scarred by contact with the Immaterium. And the ship herself, damaged in ways that would take months to repair. "Status report," Korvax demanded, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Navigation holding," Calvera replied. "Estimate 29 days to Mandeville Point. Recommend no deviation from current course." "Understood. All decks, casualty count and damage assessment." The reports came in, each one worse than the last. The Serpent's promise had survived, but barely. If the gellar field had flickered for even a moment longer, they would all be dead or worse. Calvera remained in his throne, his third eye burning, and continued to navigate. There was no time for fear, no time for grief. The dead would be given their rights later. For now, the living needed him to guide them home. The journey continued, day after day, week after week. The warp remained violent, throwing storm after storm at the ship, but Calvera navigated them all. He slept in 5-minute intervals, his body sustained by stimulants and sheer willpower. The whispers never stopped, but he had learned to tune them out, to focus on the Astronomicon and nothing else. On the 38th day, they reached the Mandeville Point. Calvera guided the ship through the translation, feeling reality reassert itself. And then they were in real space, battered but intact. He slumped in his throne, his third eye closing, and allowed himself a moment of pure relief. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. "Navigator to command," he croaked. "Translation successful. We have returned to the Ultima Segmentum." "Outstanding. Tertius," Korvax replied, but his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. The Rogue Trader had seen the cost of this journey. The crew members dead or mad, the ship damaged. He understood now, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to travel the warp. Calvera was disconnected from the throne and carried to the infirmary, his body too weak to walk. The medical servitors worked on him for hours, repairing the damage that 6 weeks of constant strain had inflicted. When he finally woke, Harkin was standing beside his bed, his expression grim. "You're lucky to be alive," the medici officer said bluntly. "Your stress hormones are at levels I've never seen. Your heart is showing signs of damage. And there's something else." Harkin hesitated, then pulled out a data slate and showed Calvera the scans. His brain, captured in exquisite detail by medical augury, showed unusual patterns. Dark spots, small lesions scattered through the tissue. These are areas of neural degradation, Harkin explained. Common in navigators who have served for decades, but yours are more advanced than I would expect for someone your age. Whatever happened during that transit, it accelerated the damage. Calvera stared at the scans, feeling curiously detached. He had known this was coming, had seen the signs for years, but seeing it confirmed, seeing the physical evidence of his mind's slow destruction, was different. "How long do I have?" he asked. Harkin looked uncomfortable. "That depends. With treatment, you could serve for another decade. Without treatment, maybe 5 years before the degradation becomes severe enough to affect your performance. And the treatment? Expensive, and not entirely effective. It slows the process but doesn't stop it." Calvera closed his eyes. 10 more years of this. 10 more years of whispers and horror, of fighting to keep his sanity, while things from the warp tried to peel back his mind. 10 more years of watching crew members die or go mad, of knowing that each journey might be the one where he finally broke. "I'll take the treatment," he said, because what else could he say? This was his purpose. This was what he had been bred for. Harkin nodded and left, taking the data slate with him. Calvera lay in the infirmary bed, staring at the ceiling, and listened to the whispers that never truly stopped. "Tertius." His mother's voice murmured, "I'm proud of you." He knew it was not really her. He knew it was just the warp, using his memories against him. But the words still hurt, still cut through his carefully maintained defenses. Because part of him wanted it to be true. Part of him wanted to believe that somewhere, in some way, his mother was watching him and was proud of what he had become. But there was no pride in what he had become. There was only duty and suffering and the slow erosion of everything that made him human. The days in real space passed slowly. Calvera underwent treatment, expensive medical procedures that promised to slow the neural degradation. He did not ask where Korvax got the funding for such treatment. Rogue traders had resources beyond the understanding of normal imperial citizens, and it was better not to inquire too closely. Between treatments, Calvera spent his time in his quarters, reading and praying. He found some comfort in the Lectitio Divinitatis, the holy text that proclaimed the emperor's divinity. The passages about sacrifice and duty resonated with him. Every navigator was, in a sense, a martyr for the Empyrean, giving their sanity and their lives so that humanity could traverse the stars. But late at night, when the stimulants wore off and the pain returned, Calvera would wonder if the emperor truly cared about his sacrifice. The emperor had been worshipped for 10,000 years, had consumed countless billions of souls to fuel the Astronomicon. Did one more navigator matter to such a being? Did one more broken mind register in that vast cosmic consciousness? The questions were dangerous, bordering on heresy, and Calvera pushed them away. Faith was all he had left. If he lost that, there would be nothing holding him together. On the 43rd day in real space, Korvax summoned him to the command deck once more. "Tertius, we have another contract. The Adeptus Mechanicus requires transport to the goal stars. The pay is exceptional. The goal stars." The name alone made Calvera's third eye throb beneath its binding. The goal stars were a region of space on the eastern fringe, notorious for its warp storms and Xenos presence. Navigators who traveled there often did not return, and those who did were rarely the same. "That region is extremely hazardous," Calvera said carefully. "The warp currents are unpredictable, and the Astronomicon's light is very weak. I would need additional compensation for such a journey." Korvax's augmetic eye wared as he studied Calvera. "Your contract allows me to assign you to any journey I deem necessary. However, I'm not unreasonable. I'll double your standard fee and provide a bonus upon successful completion. Additionally, I'll cover any medical expenses you incur as a result of the journey." It was a generous offer, more than Calvera had expected, but he knew what it meant. Korvax was acknowledging the extreme danger, was essentially admitting that this journey might kill or permanently damage his Navigator. The extra compensation was not kindness. It was hazard pay. "When do we depart?" Calvera asked. "1 month. That gives you time to complete your medical treatment and prepare." 1 month. 4 weeks to rest, to gather his strength for what might be his final journey. Calvera should have felt grateful for the time, but instead he felt only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had been doing this for 40 years. 40 years of staring into the warp, of fighting against the madness that gnawed at his sanity. And for what? So that rogue traders could make profit. So that the Imperium could maintain its sprawling, inefficient empire. But these thoughts were heresy, and heresy was the first step toward damnation. Calvera forced them away and focused on the practical concerns of preparation. The month passed quickly. Calvera underwent intensive medical treatment. His body strengthened and his neural pathways reinforced with expensive augmetics. He studied charts of the goal stars, such as they existed, and consulted with other navigators who had survived journeys to that region. Their advice was uniforms. Trust the Astronomicon, stay vigilant, and pray. The night before departure, Calvera stood in his quarters and stared at his reflection. The silver lines had spread across his forehead, more pronounced now, impossible to fully hide. Soon, very soon, the mutations would become obvious, and his career would be over. But he had one more journey in him. One more dive into the warp. One more dance with madness. After that, he would retire, would accept the inevitable confinement, and study. He would have earned his rest, such as it was. Calvera unwrapped his third eye and stared at his reflection, seeing all the ways he had been changed by decades of warp exposure. The eye stared back, lidless and inhuman, and in its depths, he thought he saw his mother's face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure if he was apologizing to her or to himself. The eye offered no answers. It never did. The next morning, Calvera made his way to the navigation chamber and settled into the throne. The servitors connected the neural cables, their movements mechanical and efficient. Korvax's voice came over the vox, wishing him luck and invoking the Emperor's protection. Calvera unwrapped his third eye and began the translation sequence. The serpent's promise dropped into the warp, and the whispers began. "Welcome back, Tertius. We've been waiting." The journey to the goal stars was everything Calvera had feared and worse. The warp in that region was a roiling chaos. Storms layered upon storms, currents that shifted without warning. The Astronomicon's light was barely visible, a distant flicker that wavered and dimmed. Navigating without a clear reference point was like walking through a darkened room filled with knives. Every decision was a gamble, every course correction a leap of faith. Calvera pushed his third eye to its limits, searching for any sign of stability, any pattern he could exploit. The daemons were worse here too. They swarmed the ship in numbers Calvera had never seen, pressing against the Geller field like a tide. He could hear them, their voices blending with the whispers, promising power and knowledge and release. On the 14th day, the Geller field began to fail. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow degradation, the field's strength ebbing like blood from a wound. Calvera watched in horror as the protective bubble around the ship grew thinner, more permeable. Daemons began to manifest in the corridors, not fully corporeal but solid enough to harm. The crew fought desperately, but they were losing ground. Each deck that fell to the daemons weakened the ship's structural integrity, made it harder for the Geller field to maintain cohesion. "Navigator, we need options," Korvax transmitted, his voice tight with stress. Calvera's mind raced. They were still weeks away from their destination, too far to risk an emergency translation. But if they continued on their current course, the Geller field would fail completely, and they would all die. There was another option, but it was insane. "Suicidal. I can attempt a warp jump," Calvera said slowly. "It's an advanced technique, not fully tested. We would essentially drop deeper into the warp, into currents that move faster. It would cut our journey time significantly, but the risk is enormous. What kind of risk? The deeper currents are where the most powerful entities dwell. If we attract the wrong attention, the Gellar field will not save us. Silence on the Vox. Calvera could imagine Korvax weighing the options, calculating profit and loss. Even now, do it. Korvax said finally, "We're dead if we stay on this course anyway." Calvera nodded, though no one could see him. He reached out with his third eye, searching for the deeper currents, the places where the warp's chaos was most concentrated. It was like staring into the heart of a furnace, and his third eye burned with the intensity of it. He found what he was looking for, a current that moved with impossible speed, a river of pure psychic energy. If he could guide the ship into it, they would be carried toward their destination far faster than conventional navigation. But the things that dwelled in those depths were beyond comprehension, entities so powerful that even thinking about them was dangerous. Calvera took a breath, offered a prayer to the Emperor that he did not truly believe would be answered, and pulled the ship into the deeper current. The universe screamed. The serpent's promise plunged into chaos that defied description. Colors that should not exist, sounds that tore at the mind, sensations that violated every law of physics. Calvera's third eye burned with agony, processing information that his brain was never meant to handle. And in that chaos, he saw them. The things that dwelt in the deepest parts of the warp. Not daemons, but something else. Something older and more terrible. They were vast beyond measure, their bodies composed of psychic energy, so concentrated it had achieved a kind of terrible sentience. They were the nightmares that spawned nightmares, the fears that gave birth to phobias, the madness that created insanity. And they noticed him. Calvera felt their attention like a physical blow, crushing down on his consciousness. They reached for him, seeking to understand this small, fragile mind that had dared to enter their domain. Their touch was agony, each second of contact stripping away layers of his psyche. He saw things he should not see. The birth of the warp, when the war in heaven tore reality apart. The slow corruption of the Elder, their fall into darkness. The moment when Slaanesh was born, when an entire civilization's depravity achieved critical mass and created a god. He saw the Emperor, not as the golden god of imperial propaganda, but as he truly was. A man, powerful beyond measure, but still fundamentally human, chained to a throne by his own ambitions, slowly dying over the course of 10 millennia. And he saw the truth of the Astronomicon, that it was not just the Emperor's light, but the screams of 10,000 souls being consumed daily, their psychic energy channeled and amplified. The truth was too much. Calvera felt his mind beginning to fracture, to splinter under the weight of revelation. He was going to break, going to shatter like glass, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard a voice. Tertius. His mother's voice, but different now. Not the daemon's mockery, but something genuine, something that cut through the noise. You have to come back. Your journey isn't finished. It was impossible. His mother was dead, her soul consumed long ago. But the voice persisted, and with it came a warmth, a sense of love and pride that he had not felt in decades. Come back, Tertius. Come back to yourself. He focused on that voice, used it as an anchor. Slowly, painfully, he pulled his consciousness back together, gathering the scattered fragments of his mind. The entities in the deep tried to hold him, to keep him for study and examination, but he resisted. He was Tertius Calvera, Navigator of House Calvera, and he would not be broken. Not here. Not now. With a final, desperate effort, he pulled the serpent's promise out of the deep current and back into the relative safety of the upper warp. The ship lurched, reality reasserting itself, and Calvera collapsed in his throne. When he woke, Harkin was standing over him, looking more worried than Calvera had ever seen him. You've been unconscious for 3 days, the Medicae officer said. Your neural activity was off the charts. I thought we'd lost you. 3 days. Calvera's voice was hoarse. What's our position? We're approaching the Mandeville point for the goal stars. Whatever you did, it worked. We're going to make it. Calvera closed his eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. They had survived. Against all probability, they had survived. But he knew that something fundamental had changed. The things he had seen in the deep, the truths he had glimpsed, could not be forgotten. They would stay with him, reshaping his understanding of the Empyrean, of the Emperor, of everything he had believed. The serpent's promise translated into real space 3 days later. The journey had taken 31 days, instead of the expected 60, and they had lost only 40 crew members. By the grim standards of warp travel to the goal stars, it was a resounding success. But Calvera knew the true cost. He had stared into the deepest parts of the warp and survived, but that survival had come at a price. The silver lines on his forehead had spread across his entire face now, impossible to hide. His third eye would no longer fully close, remaining perpetually half open even with the leather binding in place. And the whispers had changed. They were no longer just his mother's voice, but a chorus of voices, all the souls he had encountered in the deep. They spoke to him constantly now, a background noise that he could never fully tune out. Harkin confirmed what Calvera already knew. The neural degradation had accelerated dramatically. He had months, perhaps a year, before the damage became severe enough to render him unable to navigate. His career was over. Korvax paid the promised bonus without complaint, along with a substantial retirement package. The rogue trader had been shaken by the journey, had seen how close they had come to annihilation. He did not try to convince Calvera to make another journey, and for that, Calvera was grateful. The serpent's promise remained in the goal stars for 2 weeks, while Korvax conducted his business. Calvera spent that time in his quarters, writing. He documented everything he had seen, every truth he had glimpsed in the deep parts of the warp. The document would be heretical, dangerously so, but he felt compelled to record it anyway. When the time came to return to the Ultima Segmentum, Korvax had hired a new navigator, a young woman from House Belisarius. She was eager and confident, not yet broken by years of exposure to the warp. Calvera envied her innocence, even as he pitied her for what lay ahead. The journey back was uneventful, at least by the standards of warp travel. Calvera remained in his quarters, no longer needed, no longer useful. He listened to the whispers and wrote, documenting 40 years of service, 40 years of accumulated horror. When they finally reached their home port, Calvera disembarked with a single bag containing his personal effects and the sealed document he had written. He had already made arrangements with House Calvera for his retirement. He would be taken to a secure facility, where he would be studied and cared for until the neural degradation progressed to the point of no return. But he had one final task to complete. Calvera made his way through the port city to the Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant, a massive structure that dominated the skyline. Inside, among the countless pilgrims and worshippers, he found a young priest and pressed the sealed document into his hands. "Keep this safe," Calvera said. "Do not open it until after I am dead, and when you do open it, read it carefully. Decide for yourself what to do with the information." The priest looked confused but accepted the document. Calvera did not wait for questions. He turned and walked away. Disappearing into the crowd, his duty was complete. Whatever came next was beyond his control. The facility where House Calvera confined their retired navigators was located on a remote moon, far from prying eyes. It was comfortable, as such places went, with private rooms and medical care. But comfort could not disguise the truth. This was a prison, a place where broken navigators were stored until they died or went completely insane. Calvera settled into his new life with a kind of resignation. The neural degradation continued, slowly erasing his ability to form new memories. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, until they were all he could hear. Sometimes he would have moments of clarity, brief windows where his mind functioned almost normally. In those moments, he would remember his career, the journeys he had made, the crew members who had died. And he would wonder if it had been worth it. The Imperium continued, vast and inefficient and cruel. Humanity spread across the galaxy, sustained by the sacrifices of people like him. Navigators and psychers, and soldiers who gave everything so that the species could survive. But was mere survival enough? Was it worth the cost? These were the questions that haunted Calvera in his final years. Questions without answers, doubts that could never be resolved. On his final day, when the neural degradation had progressed to the point where his body could no longer sustain life, Calvera lay in his bed and listened to the whispers. They were almost comforting now, familiar companions that had been with him for decades. Tertius. His mother's voice said, warm and loving, "It's time to come home." And for the first time in 40 years, Calvera allowed himself to believe that it might really be her, that somewhere beyond the veil of death, she was waiting for him. He closed his eyes, his third eye finally sealing shut for the last time, and let himself fall into the darkness. In that darkness, he heard no whispers, felt no pain. There was only silence, true silence, the kind he had been searching for his entire life. Tertius Calvera, Navigator of House Calvera, died at the age of 63. His mind finally at peace. But in the Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant, a young priest opened a sealed document and began to read. And as he read, his expression changed from confusion to horror to understanding. The truth that Calvera had glimpsed in the deep parts of the warp would not die with him. It would spread, slowly and carefully, passed from one person to another, a seed of doubt planted in the heart of the Imperium, and perhaps, in some distant future, that seed would grow into something that could change everything. But that was a story for another time. For now, there was only the endless cycle of navigator and ship, of warp and real space, of sacrifice and suffering that kept humanity's empire alive. The Imperium endured, as it always had, as it always would, built on the broken minds and shattered souls of those who served. And somewhere in the warp, the whispers continued, calling to the next generation of navigators, promising them the same fate that had claimed Tertius Calvera. The silence was never silent.